It is my great honor and privilege today to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Raymond Moody, MD, PhD. I'd like to pay tribute to Dr. Raymond Moody to recognize him specially for his induction into the Spiritual Awakenings International Circle of Honor, which is our Hall of Fame for groundbreakers and pioneers in the field of spiritually transformative experiences. Now, as most of you may know, Dr. Raymond Moody is a true groundbreaker. He's often referred to as the father of near-death experiences. In his award-winning 1975 book, Life After Life, Dr. Moody both coined and defined the term near-death experience. This has helped to change the way that we view death and dying, and it has sold over 13 million copies worldwide in multiple languages. Dr. Moody is now the author of 11 best-selling books and has sold over 20 million copies. His latest book is Proof of Life After Life, and it features his latest research, including his own shared death experience. So congratulations, Dr. Raymond Moody, for being an honoree on the Spiritual Awakenings International Circle of Honor, and thank you for your groundbreaking work.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really been looking forward to this.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be doing an interview style format, and I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to interview Dr. Moody. And I wanted to ask you, just to begin, what inspired you in the very beginning to define and coin that term near-death experiences? Were there one or two specific NDEs that really stand out in your mind as that got you to say, you know, I need to define this term and I need to write about it?
Well, actually, it began a long time before that. It had to do with the fact that my dad was kind of hostile to religion. So fortunately to me, being from the deep South, I was not exposed to religion. And I was fascinated by astronomy, which was from the time I was 7 or 8. I realized essentially that the world is unintelligible, and that was okay to me because I remember, I'm sure everybody listening to this had that experience as a kid. You wonder how big this thing is, but your mind goes out to the wall. Then you say, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of a wall? But the other option, that it goes on forever, is unintelligible too. So I've been, since I kid, I've just been fascinated with unintelligibility. So I went to the University of Virginia in 1962 to study astronomy, but I'd been interested in philosophy in high school. So I took a philosophy class, and then reading the first few pages of Plato's Republic, which is about a near-death experience. It culminates in a near-death experience. That I was woken up to before, when I went to college, I honestly didn't think that there was anybody who took the question of an afterlife seriously. Mm-hmm. I thought it was like a humor premise, like in cartoons or Jack Benny movies or such. And so I was just astonished that Plato took this seriously, and that Plato and Democritus, who was a little before Plato, who had figured out that things are made of atoms, had sort of a debate about this. And Plato took these experiences as indicators of an afterlife, but Democritus, who also studied them, said there's no such thing as a moment of death. And he said that these experiences result from the invisible biological activity even after the body appears dead. So that was my entree, but it never entered my mind that it might be something still applicable to the modern world. But in 1965, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at UVA at that time, and he lectured to student groups, and I heard him talk about his experience. I'm pretty sure it was February of 1965.
Mhm.
And George, his experience. So I think his is the one
Mhm.
that really sort of crystallized it for me. But then I've interviewed thousands and thousands of people, but there is a family resemblance to them. There's maybe about 15 common elements, but one person may have two or three or four of them, or seven or eight, or in rare cases, some people get the whole picture. But that's how it developed. It wasn't something that I was. It was just a interest of mine that I'm accustomed in my life to be fascinated by things that nobody else is interested in. So nobody was more surprised than me when this took off. I assumed that my book would go to a few medical doctors, and I was quite confident that anybody who decided to check me out on it would get the same results, which is
Mhm.
what happened.
Mhm. That is fascinating. So back in the 60s, that was another physician's near-death experience. Is that right? That first started to get you interested. Fascinating. So
Yeah.
over these years, I mean, this has been many years that you have been researching this phenomenon. You've heard thousands of accounts. I don't know if you even have a number of how many stories you've heard.
No, I'm not. It's
But
pointless to count them, really. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
I've
What?
talked to three people just last week, so.
Oh my goodness. So from all of your years of experience and thousands of people that you've spoken to, what do you think are the most important lessons that one can learn by listening to NDE experiencers' stories?
Well, I am a I got a PhD in philosophy before I went to medical school, and I was a philosophy professor of logic. And to me, the crucial issue with these things is logic. And Plato pointed out in his Phaedo, which is kind of that's the work that the Christians based their theology of the afterlife on, Plato's Phaedo.
Mhm.
Um, and in that uh, dialogue, he points out that everybody likes to listen to stories, right? I've listened to thousands of these stories, and I can't wait to hear the next ones. But as Plato pointed out, even if you had a bazillion stories, that doesn't add up to a proof of life after death. You have to have some set of concepts which link the numerous experiential narratives that we have to the sentence that there's a life after death. And that is the one that is the crucial problem, but it is not. You see, what draws most people to this is the narrative interest.
Mhm.
And very few people are interested in concepts, as I have learned
Mhm.
as a philosopher. So what that creates as difficulty is that it creates people are always in this constant state of just wanting to hear more stories, right? And
Mhm.
and it leaves you unsatisfied because there's no style to move forward in the inferences to come to an inference about it.
Mhm.
And so that's the situation we're in. However, it's when I first started being known for this was in about 1970, and I was a philosophy professor at the time. And since that time, I have had a constant stream of people who come up to me and they ask, Dr. Moody, is there proof of an afterlife? And I think back on how I was at that time. I mean, when somebody would ask me that question, my thoughts would go to Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein and Gottlob Frege and the founders of symbolic and mathematical logic, and people with eyes would roll. And what I finally realized is that when people ask that question, they're not thinking of logic. as I do,
Mm-hmm.
they're thinking of, basically what I figured out they want is what they're asking is it a rational thing to expect and anticipate that when we die, our consciousness will enter another realm of existence?
Mm-hmm.
And I say, absolutely, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for
Wonderful.
those few people like me who happen to care about reason, if you're onto that uh, pathway with it, I say, yeah, that's solved too. The great problems with the afterlife question were propounded by Plato and by David Hume much later, the great skeptic who influenced Einstein. And Hume said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Now, there's an understatement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then he went on to say, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. Now, what this means in practical terms is that I have studied the logic of unintelligibility since I was a kid, and I knew even back in the 60s when I was teaching that eventually somebody who had learned my logic of how to think about the unintelligible would happen to have a near-death experience. And I was completely confident that when they did, they would have to articulate it in a whole new way.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for this is that we're all accustomed to that. You know, people say, well, this was not in time and it was not in space, and there are no words for it. But the best I can say is I went through a passage. I got out of my body. I went through a passageway into a light. I saw my deceased relatives. I saw my life in review. I came back to my body and returned to life. Now, that is a travel narrative, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It tells about a story. But what sense does travel narrative have if there's no such thing as time and space? See, and so, but people just, now that is a soluble problem, and I've solved it.
Mm-hmm.
What is some years ago, back in 2015, I got a call from a man who had been in one of my seminars on the unintelligible some years before, and he called to tell me about his near-death experience because he had developed H1N1. He was in the hospital for 60 days, lost his leg to gangrene, had 3 cardiac arrests, and called me to tell me about the near-death experience. Incidentally, this man is a renowned scientist and sculptor. So, I mean, it's beyond a genius. And so and in the midst of all, his voice was very weak, but all of a sudden his voice became energy, and he said, and Raymond, he said, and while I was over there, he said, my mind went back to your seminar. And he said, and I saw that what you were saying is right. He said, you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. Now, what this means, folks, is how do we know that it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri? Right? Well, until the 1800s, people always assumed that the distance to the stars is unknowable. But by the 1840s, they realized that their measurements were close enough for you to realize it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So you measure the angle to nearby stars here and then wait 6 months and you get parallax, right? You can tell how far it is out there. So what I've done is I've created another, like a method of establishing parallax on the afterlife. And what this means is that when we get a lot more people who have been through this training before they have their near-death experience, then we already have thousands of cases which are viewed through the Aristotelian lens of logic, which makes it a travel narrative. But we can now see why that is not quite intelligible. But now in the future, we'll have other accounts which are slightly different, which are viewed not just through the Aristotelian lens, but also through the lens of how you think logically about unintelligible things.
Mm-hmm.
And when you combine these, we are on the road to a whole new way of investigating life after death. The trouble is, this is not going to jive with the parapsychologists, right? This is because this requires conceptual thinking, not story.
Uh-huh. I
So,
can
but we're on the way, and
yeah.
there is now a genuinely rational means. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I'm totally parapsychology in my mind is a complete pseudoscience. This is nothing personal. These are my dear friends, and they know my views, and they like me anyway. But in 2024, the reality is, life after death. The most important question is not yet a scientific question. It's
Uh-huh.
still a philosophical question.
Okay.
But there are ways where we can actually get inroads into this now. So, I mean, I think that, we're on the road to a rational comprehension of life after death.
That's just fascinating. I can really relate to what you're saying because, uh, as you know, I mean, we've spoken before and you've got my book. Um, I've had personally 5 near-death experiences, along with a whole bunch of other types of spiritually transformative experiences. And so I found myself in a very um, unusual situation after that because I'm a medical doctor like you, and I became a researcher of these experiences. So it's like you have to combine your left brain and your right brain in order to work on these phenomena. How are we going to explain this when it's truly an experience? Like that's one of the things I used to say to people. You can't really describe what love is analytically. The only way to really get what it is to experience it. You get a facsimile with words, but you don't get the experience. Are you finding that a near-death experience is that way too? That once people who've studied about it have one, they come to a whole deeper understanding?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by deeper understanding. I really do. These things are, number one, the question of life after death is the most important question. So to me, um, that means that we should take it seriously and we should investigate very carefully and so on. But that's not what happens. It's in this field, as we know, there's very little in the way of critical thinking. It's like it, it's kind of a religious thing in a way, but I mean, that's okay. People interpret these things in all kinds of different ways, but to me, I love logic, and so
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy in 2024 that we now have a way to pre-equip the mind, as it
Mm-hmm.
were,
Mm-hmm.
so that when subsequently we have a near-death experience, we'll be able to come back and talk about it in a whole new way. Well, why is that? Well, um, when people lapse into people may talk unintelligibly for several reasons. They may talk like Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll do for to write literature, right? Or Shel Silverstein. Or you may talk nonsense inadvertently, like when the coach says, "You guys pair up in threes," right? Well, if you point out to the coach that just a minute, pair up means twos, he will, in a clear state of consciousness, he will get it and he will correct himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the third kind of situation where people start talking nonsense is medical conditions like severe stress or mercury intoxication or even delirium will do it. People talk nonsense, or schizophrenia, for example. People make up neologisms and so on. And so, in a situation like that, see, a person is not correctable. If you say to them, "Hey, you're talking nonsense," they go on talking nonsense, right? But what I'm saying is, uh, let me tell you a story about when Abraham Lincoln was president. And I forgot what the event was, but it was a solemn state ceremony. And Mr. Lincoln's part called for him to mount a horse and to lead a procession away from the scene. But when he mounted the horse put its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was bouncing around and everybody was shocked into silence by embarrassment. Oh, poor Mr. Lincoln. But the president just looked down at the horse and he said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And everybody kind of melted into laughter. Well, if you think about that scenario, it's unintelligible to say that a horse could put its hoof in the stirrup and climb the board, right? That's unintelligible. But nonetheless, it raises a very distinct impression of that very movement in your mind, right? And that's how the near-death experiences work. It's technically unintelligible to say that, you know, there's no time and space, but I got out of my body and went through a tunnel. You know, that's unintelligible. But nonetheless, it communicates. It's, you know, people, there's obviously there is some characteristic of these near-death experiences that lend itself to a description in spatial terms, even though technically we realize it's not a spatial concept. But this is on the way to being corrected. I mean, you know, we have a whole new way now to look at the afterlife from a genuinely rational perspective. And the question is, how many people are going to want to look at it that way? I think.
Well, you know, in our audience today, Dr. Moody, you have a lot of people who are experiencers, who've personally had near-death experiences, and many who've had multiple near-death experiences. That might have been a surprise to you. I remember at one conference, I said, you know, I think we have to start looking at multiple near-death experiencers. And one researcher turned at me and said, oh, Yvonne, people do not have more than one near-death experience. And I remember thinking, I know you're wrong because I've had 5, but what is your understanding of
I've known a number of people over the years who had multiple near-death experiences, and most commonly because of, you know, a chronic heart condition. And some of the cardiac arrests, they did have near-death experiences, and others they didn't. And you know, I've known a number of folks who had multiple near-death experiences over a period of time. I mean, it obviously happens. Now, what we're seeing, you see, is that the afterlife is becoming infused with this life. Think about it. Near-death experiences have always occurred. Democritus and Plato wrote about it, okay? However, in the past, they were extremely rare. But what happened, which, you know, gave me all this credit for being the discoverer of near-death experiences, was the advent in the 60s and 70s of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now there's one of those things in every department store. And so, you know, what's happened is what was once an extremely rare event has now become a very common event. And so with that development, everybody, I'm sure practically everybody alive, at least in the West, knows somebody who's had a near-death experience. Right? And so what that means is the afterlife is becoming infused with this life.
I think that's wonderful. I think that's wonderful. I want to ask you, with all of your years of experience and the fact that we have so many experiencers in the audience here today, what have you found to be the most dramatic after effects, the way that people are changed by near-death experiences? And many people have asked this question, you know, do all NDEs become psychic or intuitive after their NDE, or no?
No. I mean, I think some people do develop artistic talent is one thing that sometimes people do, or because I mean, you know, creativity itself is in my opinion, a paranormal experience. That, to the Greeks, it was creativity was a supernatural event, and it's like the your contact with your muse. And we think, well, the Greeks, that was a long time ago, but ho ho, I've talked to artists all over the world, or over much of the world, who tell me that same thing. They say, this doesn't come from me. And I open up and something comes from there. And so, creativity. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so I think that probably the most dramatic after effect is this thing that people talk about. They become aware that the purpose of life is to learn to love. Right. And also what I think is not so often mentioned as a follow-up to that is something that my dear friend Dr. George Ritchie told me. And George said, he said, Ray, he said, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And George was a very kind person, and he would not say it like I'm saying, right? But I'm going to say it like what that means is, let's face it, it's very hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And the fact is, that doesn't go away, right? It's like you still find yourself embedded in this and lose control of all of that stuff. But what it does with people, I think it does put them on a path. And I knew some of these folks for decades, literally, and I saw myself how the how this plays out in their life, I think, is mostly about the love, and also sometimes about creativity. It taps into a creative pool that people didn't know they had. They become artists, or
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful answer, and it resonates with me personally, and I'm sure with many in the audience. I saw some people applauding when you were saying it's about love. That's the big message that we get from the near-death experience.
And knowledge as well. That's another thing people say, that I just hear constantly. People say that, when that's a review of their life and they're there with this being. But people say that when scenes where they had been learning something, or the way this is described, this being focuses in on it. And I've heard people say that is that they sense from what they saw that the process of learning is endless. And some people with extremely lengthy cardiac arrest talk about seeing like a whole realm that consists of people pursuing knowledge.
Fascinating. I'd like to ask you about a specific type of near-death experience, which is the distressing near-death experience. From now up till now, we've been talking about the positive ones. What is your current understanding of a distressing near-death experience? And do you think it can still have a positive, spiritually transformative impact on people?
Well, I'm not competent to make an assessment on that, because it is easier to study a large number than a small number. And I have just, I have seen, of course, over the years, people with distressing near-death experiences. But I find that it's hard to find any homogeneity about them, that they're kind of spread out all over the place. And whereas the near-death experiences more classically seem to be kind of homogenous. The negative ones are just kind of spread out. And a couple of the negative ones I remember from the early years I was doing this, it seemed to me that they were delirious, is
Yeah.
what it was.
Yeah.
And because when people describe a delirium, it's, they describe it in a certain way. It's kind of like, but it just struck me that they were describing a delirium.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I just don't know. I mean, I don't have enough information to make an assessment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd like to move on because we have a lot to cover that you touched on in your most recent book. And I wanted to talk about the shared death experience now. You, like many researchers in the field of spiritually transformative experiences, got interested in the shared death experience because you personally had a very powerful shared death experience. Could you please tell us here today about your shared death experience?
Well, my shared death experience came in the context of investigating the phenomenon myself.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in medical school, one of my own professors told me about having a near-death experience with all the characteristics, not when she was almost dead, but rather when her mother she was trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her mother. And as she said, as her mother died, she left her body. She could see the scene from above. She saw her mother beside her now in spirit form. She saw her mother recede into this opening or tunnel and saw apparitions of her mother's deceased relatives coming forward to meet her and so on. And subsequently to that, I've heard, hundreds of these. And it's um, when when people are standing by at the bedside of somebody else who's dying, it is a fairly common occurrence that the bystanders will have elements of these, what we call near-death experiences. They'll say, for example, that as grandma died, I lifted out of my body and went part way toward this light with her, and I came back and rejoined my body. Or people say that the room changes configuration, that they feel they're no longer in a three-dimensional space, but in some other kind of geometry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, and so, and the most remarkable part of, and I must confess, this next part is rather uncomfortable to me, but I have quite a number of cases of people who were there at the death of someone else who, as the other person was dying, empathically co-lived the dying person's life review, which seems to me, I mean, I'm hoping to get myself recused from my life review, much less than like a uh, like a spectator there. But um, this occurs, and
Mm-hmm.
and you can find cases of this. What is the most? And I had been investigating. It's paradoxically or coincidentally, um, I was in I was in 1994. I was with a group of people, and we were trying to figure out how to study these shared death experiences. And it happened to be Mother's Day of 1994. And I called my mom to wish her happy Mother's Day. And I found out she was ill. To make a long story short, she died 2 weeks later to the day. And so as we were there with her, I experienced this, and my wife and my sister experienced my father, who had died before, there at at the death of my mother. And so, but I don't, that is something that happened to me, but I'm more interested in the fact that this is a common thing, and
Mm-hmm.
and um and that it doesn't get the attention that near-death experiences did. See, which
Mm-hmm.
and what I think this is all about is, I've really puzzled, in a way, the fact that the bystanders at the death of someone else have this experience is even more sensational than the fact that it occurs to people who almost die. but
Uh-huh.
it just doesn't gain traction. And so I'm very interested in why. And this, I think, is the reason. When it's a near-death experience, it enables people to give a distance, right? It's not me, but this other guy, he almost died and he, right? See, so we can distance. But when it's the somebody there at the bedside of a loved one who was dying is having something, that makes it more impossible for me. You know, most people can't really imagine their own death, but they can, well, I can imagine being there at the bedside of somebody who's dying. And so it's
Mm.
just too, it's too, it's too much for folks to, because in the West, we have this way that Plato and Democritus devised of arguing about this. Um, and you know, we may not know what it means, but we know how to argue about it. Well, it could be the oxygen deprivation to the brain, we say, thanks to Lavoisier, added to Democritus's argument by, you know, identifying the agent as oxygen
Yeah.
and respiration. But it's, you know, that's a comforting thing to people that there is this sort of standard uh, apparatus for processing this.
Yeah.
But see,
Yeah.
with the shared death experience, there's no apparatus for processing.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And
And
I'm
so
think
it
go ahead.
just flies over people's head.
Yeah. I'm thinking how some skeptics say of the near-death experience, oh, this is just, you know, the dead brain,
Mhm.
the terminal misfiring or something. But how do you say that to a person who's standing at the bedside of someone who's dying?
Well, yeah, and I got to say this, folks, too, in terms of thanks for using that word skeptic, because one of the things that I have, one of my objections to this whole field of inquiry is that the so-called skeptics are actually ignoramuses who have no idea what the word skeptic means. And that it irritates me. It's not because anything to do with near-death experiences, okay? It's the fact that I love teaching philosophy. And when I get to the skeptics, I have to undo the damage to my students' minds that were done by these ignoramuses who don't look up the words they use. All right. Now, let me explain what a skeptic is. The skeptical movement was formed after Aristotle, who codified logic, by Pyrrho, Pyrrho. And in that day, the intellectual quest was not separable from the spiritual quest.
Mm.
Nowadays, we do it, but that was unthinkable to Aristotle or Plato. And so, um, what Pyrrho said is, well, we know logic, which, by the way, the so-called skeptics have no idea about logic. They are victims of what we call scientism, which is a cognitive disorder that people have. But uh, how should I say
I
this?
just have to laugh. Scientism is a cognitive disorder. I will quote you on that,
It
Dr.
is, it
Moody.
is, it is. I mean, it is. And I can show you very clearly. And when I taught epistemology, I showed my students very clearly. Let me show you why it's incoherent, okay? When I taught epistemology, the first couple of days I'd ask my students, well, what is knowledge? Right? So, and this was the 70s, so I don't know about now, or in the 80s, I did the same thing. So I don't know about nowadays, but back then, um, uh, it's well, you know, again, these are hard things to say, but um, I think this is an important point to make, so I'll make it. Okay. What Pyrrho found, and which you can do this yourself, and it really works. I discovered it as a kid. If your process is you try to knock down everything, you see, that's what I do. Instead of trying to figure out, trying to make an argument for something, I try to knock everything down. And the reason is that when you, after you go through that process, then what you come up with is maybe a little more reliable than if you're just trying to establish what you already believe, right? And so what Pyrrho said was this: logic is a system for generating conclusions from premises. Okay. So he said, what if we follow the rules? We bear down, we ask every question and we bear down with the logic. And then, and this is the essence of the skeptical inquiry, we refrain from drawing a conclusion. That's what it means. Okay. So the reason they did this was, number one, experiential. If you do that, you get into the state finally where it does a wonderful thing to your mind. But also, if you think of it procedurally, and everybody else is rushing in this direction to get to the conclusion, well, your technique is to avoid a conclusion. Then you see side pathways of inquiry that everybody else missed because they were heading to the conclusion. Now, that's what skepticism is. All right. Now,
interesting.
So-called skeptics say, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's the chemistry of the brain. That is a self-contradiction. It's saying, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such.
My goodness.
But now, back to the scientism, okay? When I taught the epistemology at the student, I'd ask, what do you think knowledge is? They'd say science, okay? So then you ask them to clarify that. And so what they come up with, and even fundamentalist religious kids, would come up with this. It's science, right? And so okay, I'd say, so finally what they would say is this. I'd say, well, what they were saying is scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge, right? And so I would write that up on the board. Scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge. And then I'd say, is that what you think? And the machinist said, yeah. So then I'd draw a rectangle around that and I'd say, how do you know that? Now, just a minute here. They've got two options. Number one, they can say, scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge, and I know that by the scientific method is petitio principum, reasoning in a circle.
In a circle, yeah.
Tell me what you set out to prove.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other option is scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge, and I know that by history or philosophy or literary theory or the law. That's a self-contradiction. So scientism is a stupid and inane and incoherent view.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I don't know if you can answer this succinctly or not, but I do want to ask you, what do you say at this point in your career to those people that still, despite all the, quote, scientific evidence about the near-death experiences being real and occurring to people even when the brain is clinically dead, that they still say that this is a hallucination? How do you
I would say about that
people?
term hallucination, I would say they should look up that term and see what it means. All right. I am a physician and I use the term hallucination as part of a diagnostic tree. And the point of this is, how am I going to help that person? Right. And so, and I see a patient in the ER who is hallucinating, and I can follow a decision tree. When thousands of people who come close to death come back in a clear state of consciousness, say the same thing, that is a hallucination only to stupid people who don't read books.
I love how blunt you are. That is wonderful. Yeah. I want to just ask you one more question about the near-death experience, and then we're going to move on to your psychomantium. Now 50 years into the process of researching and talking to near-death experiencers and other researchers, has your definition of near-death experiences changed over these 50 years? How do you define the near-death experience now from your current understanding?
Well, one of the tragedies is this whole field is that people get so wrapped up in listening to inspiring stories, which I love too, that they don't want to think conceptually. And what I think is, I remember specifically my thought process when I was coming up with and like what to call these things.
Mm-hmm.
And that process that I used for coining the term near-death experience is an active language called catachresis. And it's a figure of speech where you catachresis, it arises, the need for catachresis arises when there's some new development which it requires a name, but there's no name for it. And so I had to perform an act of catachresis. and I was kind of expecting that I would be held to the task on that score, because a lot of people in linguistics, they're sticklers for the rules, and catachresis is not a good thing for them. But it's what I think is that there is a vast complex of overlapping experiences, near-death experiences, shared death experiences, what I call swan song experiences.
What is that? Can you describe that, please? Mm-hmm.
Well, this was described in Plato's Phaedo very beautifully, and I've seen a lot of cases of it myself. It happens sometimes that people who, according to their family, they've never had any interest whatsoever in poetry, that in the few days or hours or minutes before they die, they suddenly start reciting poetry or making up poetry on the spot, or singing. I've had 2 people in my own association networks who sang themselves out as they were dying. And so what that means is, and I'm a sort of non-social person. So if 2 people in my association network, that means it's a fairly common thing. And so one of the other things that goes along with this is people say that, they start reciting poetry or singing or writing poetry sometimes as they're dying. And so these overlap, see, because the people with near-death experiences say they hear music, for example.
Yeah.
So yeah. I mean, there's a vast array of all kinds of experiences, and they're overlap with each other. Right?
Yeah. Well, this relates to one of the questions that are in the audience. So I'm going to ask you this question right now. I mean, your most recent book is Proof of Life After Life. And can you summarize for us what you think the proof is that our souls live on after death of the body?
Well, first of all, I'd say I've never had any interest in trying to persuade anybody else of this. Right? But what I say is that if you are willing to put in time to face the real, actual objections to the question of life after death, which were propounded by Plato and by David Hume and the great A.J. Ayer, the logical positivist philosopher of the early 20th century. If you really, what they have shown is the real logical difficulties in thinking about this question. And what I'm saying is, if for those who are willing to really bear down and work on this and try to think it through, then yeah, there is a way where you can think about this in a whole new way, where we can get genuinely rational information about the question of an afterlife. The trouble with that is it's not going to fly with people who are just in it for stories. Right. See, so, or if the whole process is developed just around the stories, then the logic is, that keeps people away from the stories. Right. But the trouble is, if it's all about the stories, then you never can get out of that. And that's why there's always that desire for more stories, right? Because it's endlessly unsettling and unsatisfying. But what you need to pin it down is to think logically, because In reality, in the real world, the logic that Aristotle came up with is not going to hack it for the afterlife question. I mean, for reasons anybody can see who thinks it through. But you know, if you just get so wrapped up in stories that you can't set aside some time to think rationally for a while, then you will never get out of that thing of just wanting more stories.
Well, but you are convinced. But you are convinced.
Yeah, I'm convinced, and I'll tell you why. But I'm not trying to persuade anybody else. I'll tell you my process. I realized the logical difficulties, but where I am with it is I give up. I've always realized, even from the 70s, I realized that it's not oxygen deprivation to the brain. But the fact that it is not oxygen deprivation to the brain does not therefore mean that it therefore is life after death. So there's still a big gap. What is it? And so where I've come on it is that I realized the logical difficulties, and those are proved now because we can actually intervene in the near-death experience. In effect, we can prepare the mind beforehand so that when somebody subsequently has a near-death experience, they'll be able to articulate it in a whole new way. And so that's in the background. But in terms of my personal, I just gave up. Like I have, for example, I am, let's see, how would I put it? I like thinking, okay? And I go by what I can think out. And where I should say this about myself, that I am an exercise addict. Some people, I walk, a lot every day, and people say, oh, I should be doing that. No, should don't work. You got to be an addict. And I have been an exercise addict all my life. If I got to get out every day and exercise. Okay. Now, if heaven forbid something had happened to my foot, okay, because I have to walk, that would be an utter horror to me. Now, I have a friend that I'm sure too, is Anthony Chicoria, who is a famed orthopedic surgeon and professor of orthopedic surgery.
And NDEer.
Yeah, and had a near-death experience. And Tony and my friend Eben Alexander and my friend Jeff O'Driscoll, and I could go on and on naming my medical doctor friends who have had near-death experiences, who say not only was it real, but it was more real than this thing we're in now. And then I can't reconcile my willingness to put my foot in Tony Sikoria's hands, you see, if I were to injure it. How can I trust my friend's medical judgment completely and question their unanimous experience that this was far from being a dream? This was more real than this. I mean, that's where I am. I just give up. It's not, I realize the difficulties in making a logical inference, but I'm saying I give up. I can't think my way out of it.
So you believe your friends?
I accept what, I accept that this is, that when we die, we go through a process which ends up with, as I gather, you go through an incomprehensible process and then you come out on the other side into another story, I guess.
That's a beautiful way.
Consciousness itself is a narrative phenomenon, which that's why I think David Hume said that he felt that reincarnation was the only kind of view of an afterlife that a rational person could entertain. And Hume doesn't say why, but I think it was probably because as a historian, he understood the role of narrative in human affairs, and he would have understood that reincarnation is the most narrative-like version of the afterlife. It's a story.
Yeah, awesome. Fascinating, fascinating. I'd like to ask you about something else that you talk about in your new book, which is your psychomantium. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. So can you describe this for everyone, please, and tell us what got you interested in this for facilitating what I'm going to call after-death communications or mediumistic experiences? Please describe that to everybody.
Yeah. And this is so funny to me because I did not get into this like most people do. I love Greek philosophy, like I keep saying.
We've heard that.
Yeah, and it's like I had like a flashbulb memory experience of when I was it was in I think pretty much I'm almost sure it was October of 1962, and I was reading Herodotus's Histories, and I got to this place about how Periander, the king of Corinth, had misplaced something a friend of his had left for him to take care of. And so he couldn't find it. So he sent a delegation to the Oracle of the Dead among the Thesprotians on the river Aquilon. And they called up the spirit of his Periander's wife, Melissa. And she told him what. And so I was like, what? What is an oracle of the dead? So this is something I've studied since I was 18, and it's still a shocking thing to many people. And I'm sure those pseudo-skeptics would be shocked by this, but the fact is that Western reason as we have it came here from oracles of the dead. It's these places these were along the Greek landscape, and you could go to these places and they had various procedures that they would take you through, which you would seem to see and converse with apparitions of your departed loved ones. And so those of you who remember reading the Apology might remember that that there Socrates says they have the stock criticisms of all philosophers, Socrates said, are we probe into things up in the air, which means out of body trouble, magical flight, or probes into things down under the earth, which is the oracles of the dead, where they called up the spirits of the deceased. These were underworld environments they created to have various techniques. And the techniques they used are very replicable. One is mirror gazing. You can create a dark environment where you gaze into a mirror where there's no reflections. You have a light behind you so that it diffusely fills the space. And after preparation, this is not magic, folks. It's nothing Raymond Moody does. Okay, when I started doing this, people thought, "Well, Dr. Moody can call up your dead." No, you can call up your dead relatives, and basically, what it involves is you have to think through the person who died. You bring back your memories, the good memories and the bad, the hang-ups in the relationship as well as the good things. And this is, and I would guide people through it, just asking questions, just like you would in a grief therapy session. And then they go into this environment, which is a mirror chamber where it's darkened so that you don't see any reflections in the mirror. It's just like gazing away into eternity. And under those circumstances, a high percentage of people on the very first attempt will have an experience which they interpret to be a real life encounter with a dead relative. And most say that the apparition appears in the mirror, fully dimensional. Other people say that apparition appears in the mirror, but then emerges from the mirror, comes right out into the room, a la what was Aladdin and the lamp. Right, this actually occurs. That what was happening was the mirrored surface of the brass lamp, you see, would create a depth, and so the apparition would appear to emerge from that surface, and that's what folks tell you in this. Right, the apparition may appear in the mirror and come out, or other people say that their experience is that they Their consciousness goes through the mirror and comes out into an alternate kind of state on the other side where they meet their relatives and friends. About 30% of the folks say that they hear the audible voice of the deceased. Almost all of the rest of them, even though they don't hear an audible voice, will say there's a heart-to-heart or mind-to-mind communion with the person who died. And another method that was also used in the Greek oracles of the dead was dream incubation. And the way you do this is you write a letter, a heartfelt letter to the person who died. You ask all your questions and you pour out your feelings, and then you fold the letter and you put it under your mattress and you forget about it. And I don't know what percentage, because I'm not on the site, but it's an appreciable proportion of the people who do this will have a vision and they say, well, I have to call it a dream because I was asleep, but it didn't have the quality of the dream. It seemed, hyper real kind.
Yeah.
And so those are two, established means that go back in the history of Western civilization to the very beginning, right? But why don't we have it now? I think it was the church. Up until the 300s, this was in Christianity, according to a guy at the Cambridge University Department of Religious Studies sent me a communication some time ago saying that that the early Christians did this, but then in 300 something they banned it because by then it was all an ideology. They didn't want people to fool around with themselves.
And have direct experiences. Yes.
And so, but these, you can call up the dead. And why don't people do it? Well, I think because it interferes with this realm too much. I mean, the plain reality is, I hear all the time from people who are mourning, if I only had 5 more minutes. Well, it's perfectly possible to have that 5 more minutes.
Fascinating.
But the trouble is that how do you integrate something like that to this society? See?
Yeah. Now that is a challenge. In our audience, we have mainly STE experiencers, people who've had diverse types of spiritually transformative experiences, and many have had spontaneous mediumistic experiences after death communications. And many near-death experiencers find, as an after effect of their near-death experience, they're more open to mediumistic experiences. Now,
well, I haven't heard that, but I mean, that's interesting. Yeah.
So I have a question again about your psychomantium. Have you yourself had some experiences there in the psychomantium?
Well, I did. Yeah, I saw my grandmother. I mean, what can I say? I saw my grandmother. I talked to my grandma, and it's I'm utterly astonished by it, but I'm joining the ranks of many astonished people because I've guided hundreds of people through my psychomantion work. And, people come out of there saying, not, I had this experience, but I talked to my mom. So it's interpreted to be a real event.
Yeah. And from what you wrote in your book, often very healing for people as well.
Yeah.
Which is the whole point.
Yeah. That's right. There was a study done years later by somebody interviewed people who had had psychomantion experiences as long as 5 years before, and found that even after that time, it was still, mine was 30 years ago. I remember it just like it was yesterday.
Awesome. Well, there have been many, many questions and comments coming up in the chat, and many people sharing some of their near-death experiences, some of their shared death experiences. Somebody asked an interesting question, which is, do you have any sort of podcast? And if you don't, they'd love for you to have one because they'd love to hear your wisdom on a regular basis.
Well, folks, I have Asperger's syndrome, and one of the things that is one of my deficits is I can't do anything mechanical. I can't tie my shoes. I can't tie a tie. I can't use a computer. I can't type. I mean, I've been all these educational psychologists I went through. I mean, it's just me. And so, I don't have a, by the way, I am doing something. Um, I have a course I've put together called the Swan Song, and a new logic for proving the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing that. You can look on the lifeafterlife.com. I have to do them here because I can't travel. But so I've been doing them here. And if you're willing to come to Florida for 2 days.
Awesome. And how would people get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more about this? They do want to travel to Florida?
I have a website, and it's called lifeafterlife.com, www.lifeafterlife.com. And you can get in touch with me there. It's been very successful. It's basically, you can go through a process where you can reformat your mind to think logically about the question of life after death. It's completely doable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the difficulty is that it's not stories, it's exercises, and you have to sort of think through things. But then at the end, you come back and you can look at near-death experiences in a whole new way, or the whole question of an afterlife in a whole new way.
In a whole new way, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to ask you a couple more questions before we wrap up. And one is, you're now an elder in the field. And after all of your years of work and research and contemplation and deep thought, all of the above regarding near-death experiences, shared death experiences, other spiritually transformative experience, what message would you like to pass on to the next generation of experiencers, of people who are actually having these experiences here and now?
Well, don't be awed by what's gone before. There's no such thing as an expert on life after death, right? It's like people say, I'm an expert. What am I supposed to be an expert on? I'm an expert on the unknown and a specialist in guesswork. So what I would say to the people who are coming up to near-death experiences, to study near-death experiences, don't go by what's done before. Just look at it a new way. There are whole new ways to see it. And the first thing to work on is your mind. I was a forensic psychiatrist, and I loved doing it. And I remember the first time I was all happy and I was getting ready to, start studying forensic psychiatry. And so I went to the lecture, and the lecturer said, he was talking about, greetings to the new forensic psychiatrist. And what he said, well, let's just start talking about murder. And the first place to look at is in you, right? Like, why am I interested in this? That's why that's where you got to start in being a forensic psychiatrist, is looking at what makes you so fascinated by homicide that you want to spend time talking to people who committed it. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's similar. It's start inside yourself to look, why are you interested in this? And don't read all these books that have already been done about it. I mean, do, but not from a believing point of view. I like to, as a place to start your work, just look at it in a whole new way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the way to do it. It's like the proof of life after death is not going to come from what I call the afterlife establishment. Mm-hmm. What do I call the afterlife establishment? Well, in reality, rational investigation of life after death began with the ancient Greeks. And that's the reality. But the afterlife establishment began in 1848 with two little girls cracking their toes. And that is the reality, no matter how much anybody wants to deny it. You've got to come to the reality that the modern research into life after death did not come from the rational tradition, but from little girls cracking their toes in upstate New York. And anybody who wants to read that story can find it's fascinating. But what I'm saying is the afterlife establishment is enmeshed in scientism, in all these shady and flighty and ephemeral arguments. It has no real standards of credentials. I went some years ago. I went to Europe, and this woman in Denmark, a physician, got interested in near-death experiences, so she was going to form a conference in Denmark of specialists who were investigating near-death experiences. And so she was shocked. She was telling me, oh, now some of the people, already arranged this to come, but now she's worried because she said some lady that I don't know who this was, but she said she was thinking of inviting some woman to Denmark to lecture on this. And she looked up the woman's credentials, and the woman's credentials, it was a diploma mill in India. And the way you get your degree is to submit a saliva sample. Now, this woman was talking to people about near-death experiences and portraying herself as an expert. I mean, I don't know who it was, but what I'm getting at is that this field needs to shape up. You can't make genuine advances just by telling stories, no matter how inspirational the stories are. You got at some point to sit down and think through concepts. And that's completely doable. And so that is the point of all this, is to address to those young folks who are coming up to investigate these near-death experiences. Don't get involved in the afterlife establishment or parapsychology. This is pseudoscience, folks. Look at it in a whole new way, and we can make advances in this.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Moody. I think that's a perfect and beautiful way to wrap up our interview today. I want to thank you once again for your years of deep and thorough investigation into the near-death experience phenomenon. And I'm very, very grateful you have shared your wisdom with us today. And congratulations again for your new book, and also congratulations for being an honoree on the Spiritual Awakenings International Circle of Honor.
Well, thank you all so much. And I just, all those folks listening in, thank you so much. I mean, I'm just delighted. I am a little bit restless today, if maybe you can see why, but what happened wasn't my vigorous walk this morning. I stretched my calf, and I'm just sitting here a little trying to get in a comfortable position, which is why you might have seen me moving around a lot.
Well, you were absolutely wonderful, and we're really, really grateful for your presentation today. So thank you, Dr. Moody.